Picture this for a moment. A country where April 15th doesn't matter anymore. No IRS letters in the mailbox. No long nights spent digging through folders for receipts. No tax forms piling up on the kitchen table. Imagine a nation where your paycheck is truly your paycheck, where the government doesn't take a slice before you even see it. While this might sound like science fiction or a futuristic headline, it's something President Trump just brought directly into the national spotlight. And that's only the beginning. Because in that very same week, he unveiled something else, something so big, so historic, that it could reshape the financial future of an entire generation of American children. A brand new program, record-breaking private donations, and an economic shift almost nobody saw coming. Meanwhile, as these announcements were dominating the news cycle, Costco, yes, Costco, the retail giant known for 150 hot dogs in bulk, groceries had launched a massive lawsuit against the Trump administration, a bold challenge to the new tariff structure, raising major questions about future prices, American companies, and the long-term direction of U.S. manufacturing. So today we're unpacking the major move Trump just made, the economic shockwaves now rippling across the country, and what all of this means for you, your family, and the future of America. Because once you see how these pieces connect, the picture becomes absolutely stunning. Let's begin in the Oval Office, where the first domino fell. President Trump sat down, looked straight into the camera, and said something most politicians would never dare say out loud. The federal income tax, as we know it, might be going extinct. Not reformed, not tweaked, extinct. Now, if you're like most Americans, your first reaction might have been, wait, how is that even possible? And that's a fair question. Income tax has been a part of American life for over a century. It pays for everything from highways to aircraft carriers to Social Security checks. So how could something so foundational simply disappear? Here's the twist. Trump isn't talking about unfunded government chaos. He's talking about going back to the way America funded itself for the first 70 years of its existence, before the income tax ever existed. Back then, the federal government raised the overwhelming majority of its revenue through tariffs on imported goods, not by subtracting money from every worker's paycheck. And once you understand the timing, the logic behind it becomes clear. Because behind the scenes, the current system is on the verge of collapse. The IRS, the agency responsible for collecting taxes and enforcing compliance, is shrinking. Not slowly, not slightly. It's been losing staff at an alarming rate. Enforcement staffing alone has dropped by more than 1/3. Think about that. 1/3 of the people who used to ensure taxes were collected properly have vanished, and the impact is showing up in the data. The IRS is now able to audit only around 2/5 of all tax revenue, the lowest level in modern history. Even audits of millionaires, the people most able to hide or shift income, have fallen by more than 2/3. The very individuals who should face the closest scrutiny are now flying under the radar. Simply put, the enforcement engine is broken. Why does that matter? Because when the system fails, everyone feels the consequences. The government can't collect the money it's owed. Deficits soar. Debt piles up. And eventually someone has to pay the bill. That someone is almost always the middle class. The group that doesn't have offshore accounts, corporate shelters, or complex loopholes. But a collapsing IRS is just the first half of the story. The federal government is now grappling with a debt crisis unlike anything in American history. In just the first 7 months of the most recent fiscal year, the U.S. government spent over $500 billion, yes, billion, just on interest payments. Not on education, not on healthcare, not on infrastructure, not on defense. Just interest on previous borrowing. To put that into perspective, America is now spending more on interest than it spends on the entire national defense budget. More than Medicare, more than most major federal programs combined. We are literally borrowing money to pay interest on money we already borrowed. Does that sound sustainable? Unfortunately, that's only the beginning. Since the year before the last presidential election, for every single dollar of new tax revenue coming in, Washington has added more than $150 in new spending. $1 in, $158 out. In the real world, that's not budgeting. That's bankruptcy. Our national debt is now climbing by roughly $1 trillion every 100 days. At that speed, the United States isn't just facing fiscal pressure, it's entering a full-blown debt spiral. And the current tax system, confusing, sprawling, and 4 million words long, is incapable of fixing it. This is where Trump's tariff proposal comes in. Because if the IRS is shrinking, The debt is exploding, and the income tax-based system is mathematically unsustainable. Then the only solution might be to replace the system entirely. Trump is proposing a return to the historical model. Fund the government through tariffs instead of taxing income. Instead of taxing American workers, the government would tax foreign goods. Instead of chasing 150 million taxpayers every year for forms, paperwork, and audits, revenue would be collected at the ports. Simple, transparent, more predictable. And it shifts the burden from labor to trade. Critics argue that tariffs can't replace income tax revenue. And they're right, if government spending remains sky high. But that's the hidden element. A tariff-based system forces Washington to live within its means. It caps revenue and cuts off the ability to expand spending endlessly. It ends the political game of promising tax hikes on certain groups or giveaways to others. The system becomes fixed, predictable, and immune to manipulation. Whether this transition happens next year or in the next decade, many experts agree the current system cannot survive. Trump's announcement simply accelerates the conversation. But while America was still digesting that bombshell, Trump unveiled a second shock, one that targeted not Washington, not corporations, but America's children. He called it the Trump Accounts Program, and here's how it works. Every child born in the U.S. between 2025 and 2028 will receive $1,000, deposited into an investment account tied to the overall stock market. This isn't a welfare payout. It's an investment with decades of compound growth. Left untouched, that $1,000 could turn into tens of thousands by the time the child turns 18, and much more if parents choose to contribute along the way. This program gives every child, no matter their background, a personal stake in America's economic future, a reason to understand investing, a path toward home ownership, education, entrepreneurship, or retirement without starting life buried in debt. But then came the twist that shocked everyone. The initiative was being supercharged by one of the largest private donations in American history. Michael and Susan Dell announced they would contribute over $6 billion, not million, to jumpstart the program. This donation doesn't just help newborns. It extends to children already here, kids under age 10 in communities where median household income is $150,000 or less. Each of these children would receive $250 to begin their investment journey. Supporters say it's a game changer for seniors and grandparents. It offers something priceless, the knowledge that future generations won't start life at zero. They'll have a foundation, a head start, a chance at generational wealth. Critics, however, raise concerns. Injecting billions into the stock market could push up asset prices. Others question who manages the money, the government, private firms, or both. And some argue it's simply political strategy. But the program addresses these concerns. Investments are spread out across years. Funds are placed in broad index portfolios, not individual stocks. Management is handled by a private-public partnership called Invest America, with transparency and oversight. And then, just as America was processing all of this, Costco stepped onto the stage with a legal bombshell. The company filed a massive lawsuit demanding refunds for tariffs they believe were imposed illegally using emergency presidential powers from the 1970s. Costco relies heavily on imports. About 1/3 of everything they sell comes from overseas. When tariffs increase, companies face two choices: absorb the cost or pass it on to customers. Neither option is ideal, so Costco chose a third route: challenge the policy directly in court. Their argument: the emergency powers Trump used were never intended to support long-term, sweeping economic tariffs. And if the Supreme Court eventually agrees, Costco wants every penny refunded, potentially billions. The deadline to file was mid-December, and Costco met it. Now the case moves forward, and the Supreme Court's past skepticism toward executive tariff powers suggests Costco might have a real shot at winning. But here's the chaos scenario. If the court rules the tariffs illegal, who gets refunded? Only companies that sued? Every importer in America? And where does the government find the money when the Treasury is already strained? One justice asked the perfect question: how do we unscramble this egg? Because once tariff revenue is collected and spent, reversing it isn't simple. And that brings us to today, a moment where three massive stories collide. A potential end to income tax, a revolutionary investment program for children, a corporate showdown that could reshape tariff law, three separate events, one enormous moment of economic transformation. And as all of this unfolds, the only question left is simple: Let's break this down in a way that connects all the dots. Because at its core, this story isn't just about tariffs, lawsuits, or political messaging. It's about something much more personal: your wallet, your paycheck, and your monthly bills. And that's where we begin. So, what does this lawsuit actually mean for you and your day-to-day life? To understand that, we need to start with tariffs, not in economic jargon, but in plain language. A tariff is simply a tax the government places on imported goods. When a retailer like Costco brings in products from overseas, they pay that tax at the border. That increases the cost of those products before they ever hit the shelves. Now companies have two options. They can absorb that cost themselves, which reduces their profits. Or, and this is far more common, they can pass part of that cost on to consumers. That means higher prices at checkout. So if you've walked through Costco lately and noticed your favorite snacks, electronics, or household items creeping up in price, tariffs are very likely part of that equation. Of course, tariffs aren't the only factor. We've had inflation. We've had supply chain disruptions. We've had rising labor costs. But tariffs are undeniably in the mix, sitting quietly behind the scenes, adding pressure to retail prices across the country. And that brings us to the interesting part. Tariffs aren't just about raising money for the government. They're also a tool to change corporate behavior. If it becomes too expensive for American companies to import shrimp from India, a US-based shrimp industry suddenly becomes more competitive. If building electronics overseas becomes more costly than assembling them in states like Ohio or Texas, those factories begin to come back home, at least in theory. But theory isn't the same as reality. Manufacturing doesn't return to America overnight. A factory isn't something you build with a snap of your fingers. It requires planning, land, workers, machinery, supply chains, contracts, and years of preparation. So tariffs may eventually bring jobs back, but in the short term, they usually bring higher prices. And that right there is the dilemma. If you're living on a fixed income, a pension, disability, retirement, or hourly wage, you don't have the luxury of waiting 5 years for American factories to revive. You need affordable groceries today, affordable medicine today, affordable basic goods today. That's why this debate around affordability has become so emotional and so central to national politics. Now, let's talk about affordability in real terms, because the data paints a sobering picture. According to recent figures from one of the largest U.S. banks, nearly 1/4 of American households are now living paycheck to paycheck. And not because they're irresponsible. These are families spending 95% of their income just to survive. Rent, food, childcare, transportation, utilities, insurance. By the time the necessities are paid, there's almost nothing left. For millions of families, there's no emergency cushion, no savings account, no investment account, no room for the future, just survival. And here's the number that truly hits home. The average American household is spending roughly $200 more per month than they were just a year ago for the same cart of groceries, the same gas tank, the same basic life. That adds up to around $2,500 extra per year. But if you zoom out further, back to early 2021, the increase is jaw-dropping. Families are now paying around $1,000 more every month compared to that period. $1,000 every single month. Families feel it, retirees feel it, small businesses feel it, everyone feels it. Now, some people want to blame the current administration for this. Others say the previous administration set the stage. And the reality is that inflation has multiple causes and plenty of blame to go around. But here's the uncomfortable truth economists point to. Prices keep rising largely because people keep spending. If consumers truly cut back on non-essentials, demand would fall and prices would be forced down. That's economics 101. But we're human. We don't want to give up comfort. We don't want to sacrifice convenience. And as long as spending remains strong, companies have no incentive to reduce prices. So how do you get people to reduce spending? In a free society, you really can't force it. Historically, only two things reliably push people to cut back: a recession or very high interest rates. And right now, nobody wants a recession. So the Federal Reserve relies on the second tool, keeping interest rates high enough to cool demand. But that brings its own pain. Borrowing becomes expensive. Mortgages become unaffordable. Starting a business becomes riskier. And families trying to buy their first home suddenly find themselves priced out. This is the bind America is stuck in. High prices force the Fed to keep interest rates high. But high interest rates strain the very families already struggling with affordability. It's a tightrope with no easy way across. This brings us to the headline that set off a political firestorm. During a cabinet meeting, a reporter asked President Trump about the affordability crisis. His response made waves. Affordability is a hoax. That was started by Democrats. Within minutes, the clip went viral. Headlines exploded. Pundits pounced. Opponents weaponized it. But here's what was lost in translation. Trump wasn't calling people's struggles fake. He was accusing Democrats of using affordability as a political attack, despite being in charge when prices surged. In other words, he was speaking to his political opponents, not to struggling families. Still, messaging matters. And when you say affordability is a hoax, people hear something very different. Your struggles aren't real. That's why the backlash was so intense. Americans don't want arguments. They want empathy. They want solutions. They want someone in Washington to say, I understand what you're going through, and here's how we fix it. To their credit, members of Trump's cabinet tried to repair the moment. The Treasury Secretary acknowledged that Americans are hurting. The Vice President pointed out that the current administration inherited high prices from the last one. They tried to offer empathy while defending policy. But once the soundbite spreads, the damage is done. In politics, perception is often more powerful than reality. And now Trump's approval rating on the economy is slipping, down to around 36% in recent polls. And it's not necessarily because the policies are failing. It's because the messaging isn't connecting with the people living this crisis day by day. Families don't want to hear about stock market highs when their grocery bill is draining their checking account. They don't want to hear about GDP growth while they're rationing gas. This is why many political observers are urging Trump to appoint an affordability czar, someone whose entire role is to speak to this crisis with clarity, empathy, and transparency, someone who can acknowledge the pain, explain the plan, and guide the public through each step being taken to bring costs down. Because the truth is, there are signs of progress. Gas prices are trending downward in many states. Some areas are seeing prices approaching $2 per gallon, a number that felt impossible not long ago. Lower energy costs have a ripple effect across the entire economy. When fuel and energy fall, transportation costs fall, production costs fall, and eventually, consumer prices follow. But people need to hear that message thoughtfully, not defensively. They need to feel seen, not dismissed. And right now, that connection isn't happening consistently enough. So where does all of this leave us? What does it mean for the future? This week wasn't just a random mix of headlines. It was a turning point, a collision of three monumental forces. First, the collapse of the old tax system. The IRS is shrinking, audits are down, enforcement is weaker than ever. Meanwhile, debt is exploding. America is spending more on interest payments than on national defense. The current system is crumbling under its own weight. Second, the rise of a bold new wealth-building model. The Trump Accounts program is aiming to give every child born within a 4-year window a financial foundation from birth, an investment stake in America's future. If it succeeds, it could change generational poverty. If it fails, it becomes just another forgotten experiment. Third, a corporate revolt. Costco, one of America's most trusted retailers, is challenging the president's tariff authority. They want refunds. They want clarity. And they're willing to fight in court for both. These forces tell us something undeniable. America's economy is at a crossroads. The old way is breaking. The new way is uncertain. And the decisions made over the next few years will shape not just your life, but your children's and grandchildren's futures. So what should you do? First, stay informed. Don't let headlines or political tribalism decide your opinion. Look at the facts. Ask questions. Second, if you have young children, grandchildren, or great-grandchildren, explore the Trump Accounts program. Even small amounts invested early can transform their future. Third, control what you can. Tighten your spending. Make thoughtful decisions. Even minor adjustments can help. And finally, stay hopeful. America has confronted bigger crises. Our nation has reinvented itself before, and it will do so again. Whether tariffs replace income tax, whether Costco wins its lawsuit, whether the Trump Accounts transform a generation, none of that is predetermined. What is certain is that the conversation has shifted. The assumptions that defined the last 50 years are being challenged, and that alone is a sign of change. If you found this expanded breakdown helpful, hit the like button. It tells YouTube this content matters. Subscribe if you haven't already, and tell me in the comments,